First of all, welcome everyone to this new webinar in our series of papers of osmosis from papers to advances. So the idea essentially, as in the previous sessions, is to deliver a very interesting and insightful webinar and presentation about a previous paper where osmosis is used as the main modeling tool to obviously answer a research question. So today we have our colleague Luis Victor Gallardo. I'm going to allow me to introduce him briefly. So Luis Victor Gallardo is technical manager at Climate Lead Group, a think tank providing energy and systems modeling, policy design, and adaptation planning for governments and development partners across Latin America and the Caribbean. He is also a PhD student in sustainable energy engineering at Simon Fraser University, where he researches distributed energy resources and demand side management in future electricity systems. So for today, Luis is going to provide a lecture, better, a presentation titled Policy Options to Mitigate the Fiscal Impact of Road Transport Decarbonization and Application to Costa Rica. Luis, thank you so much for your kindness and willingness to participate in this event, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Fernando. I just want to confirm if you can see my screen.
Yeah, it's perfect. It's in full screen,
Uh,
so yeah, you are
Thank
ready
you.
to go.
Thank you so much. So I'm joining Fernando, thanking everyone for coming to this webinar. And hopefully you're going to get some insights about what you can do in your countries to study this interesting problem. So as the title is saying, there's a fiscal impact of road transport decarbonization that is important to understand. Um, and we're going to start with this question: why should governments plan a transition for new fiscal revenues in a world that consumes less fossil fuels? And this is a graph taken from an OECD report with the revenue statistics in Latin America and the Caribbean. And what it's showing is that about 0.5% of GDP comes from import taxes on diesel and petrol. So this is import taxes for countries that do not produce gasoline or do not produce diesel. They need to import that energy. Um, these Latin American countries depend heavily on taxing these resources. Now, there are other types of taxes. You can imagine countries that produce fossil fuels and have an industry um, to take advantage of these resources can have other kinds of taxes on production. What we're going to focus on today is taxes on the consumption side of the fossil fuels. And this is no minor problem. 0.5% of GDP is a big number. You can think of countries running fiscal deficits. The recommended sort of rough value of a fiscal deficit is about 3% of GDP. So 0.5% is non-trivial relative to this 3% of GDP rules for deficits. And then we're going to see that some countries, in particular Costa Rica, have about 20% of their fiscal revenue depending on transport-related taxes. So as you can see in this graph, there are sort of two main components of this revenue. There's the energy associated revenue, which you can think of as taxes on the fuel, and there's transport-related taxes. There are different kinds of taxes associated with import taxes on vehicles, also property taxes, and depending on the country, you have different shares of GDP and also different compositions of the different revenues. So our goal today is going to understanding what happens to fiscal revenues without decarbonization and with decarbonization. So when we talk about decarbonization of road transportation, we're talking about not only electrification, and switching from consuming fossil fuels to electricity that can be mostly renewable, but also avoiding traffic jams and congestion that is a big problem in countries that don't have great transportation systems. Costa Rica is one example of that. So, as you can see in this slide, uh, without decarbonization and without any fiscal adjustments, governments would rely on sales taxes on vehicles, fuel taxes, property taxes, kind of the taxes we were talking about in the OECD. But in the future, once the transformation happens, what are going to be the uh, tools for the government to substitute that revenue that they're not going to receive? So the same tools can be applied, but then other tools are on the table, like taxes on electric vehicles when they're more widespread, and also taxes on distance traveled. So our goal is going to be to understand the problems and the opportunities, because it's not all bad, as we're going to see briefly. So the webinar is going to be structured in the first part, when we're going to understand the problem of the fiscal impact of road transport decarbonization more deeply, particularly for countries that import fossil fuels. Then we're going to show how we tackled this analysis of this particular paper. This was a study carried out in 2021, and we were able to publish it by 2024. We tell the story of how we accounted for this problem in Costa Rica. And then we're going to have what we learned, avenues for future research in the current state of the world, and some Q&A if there are any questions. Okay. So, now with the AI tools, what I asked Sora, the generator of images, was to try to illustrate this problem. There's a prompt, but this is kind of what tells the story of the problem we're studying. On the right hand of the figure, we have the current system. Particularly in Costa Rica, you rely a lot on you have a lot of trucks, you have a lot of cars, a lot of traffic jams, a lot of accidents. And this is a big problem. There's not a lot of public transportation. So people suffer a lot. They take long times to reach their workplaces or their schools. Now, the government does earn a lot of money out of this because if you spend more on fuel, you're gonna pay more tax. So the government has this great source of revenue, but at the same time, the governments have some commitments to decarbonizing. In Costa Rica, it means investing in public transport, investing in rail transport, systems that were not that have not been built yet, and that would benefit people a lot because they have a lot more free time, and they'll not rely so much on the private car for their transportation needs. So the government does have to invest on helping achieve this future vision. So it's like a conundrum, because if you start substituting, the image from the right towards the left, you're going to see, a shortfall. So the government is going to reduce its revenue, but it's also going to spend more. We're going to focus only on the revenue part, because the spending part is like another future part of the research that needs to be investigated, how to compensate and finance decarbonization. So we're going to understand what happens to the government's revenue and how the system on the left can actually substitute whatever unrealized revenue the government is going to have. So in Costa Rica, as I was mentioning earlier, about 20% of tax revenue comes from energy and transport activities, which is a lot. You have a 20% shortfall if those taxes went away overnight. So about half of that, 11.3% out of 20%, is fuel tax. The rest is property taxes. So you can think of property taxes as, let's say somebody has a Ferrari or a Porsche. It has a high market value. The government knows that, So every year they're going to charge a tax to the owner of that luxury car a higher rate. And so they're going to collect a bunch of money. But then uh, if you have more normal cars, those values can vary, and that represents 3.7% of the taxes. Then there's also excess taxes on vehicles. So whenever there's an importer brings the car in, wants to sell into the local market, they're going to have to pay a tax. Um, that's changed recently. Before, there were some rules that made it a little bit fuzzy about how much that tax rate was, but they changed that last year, and now the rates are like simpler to calculate. And there are other taxes like the sales tax and other transfer taxes. So whenever somebody sells a vehicle to somebody else in the secondary market, they will also pay a tax, but that is only representing 0.6% out of the 20%. And so that big 20% is going to get affected. You're going to have transport electrification that is going to eat the fuel tax revenue. So it's going to happen if we have widespread electrification. The public transport use. So if the liters of petrol and diesel are reduced because people are using more public transportation, that is very good for people. Their pockets are going to get alleviated a little bit. They're going to have more affordability in their monthly expenses. But then the government is going to lose an important and steady source of revenue. So we can sort of think of these changes. Tax revenue is going to drop because people are not spending as much fuel. People are going to save more because electric vehicles, their operating costs are much lower, and also not only the fuel but also the operation and maintenance. So there can be savings from transport electrification. Now, it's also true that with some exceptions, electric vehicles are still a little bit more expensive, although that's rapidly changing as of today because of all the market offer. We have very interesting options where it now makes sense to buy an electric vehicle or a petrol vehicle. Now, of course, there are subsidies that can affect the equation and changes in policy in different governments, but this is still a barrier, although less so. It was so much more real in 2021 than it is today because of the supply side changes to the availability of electric vehicles. And then now the good part of that is if there are more electric vehicle sales and people will start making this technological change and exchanging their old cars for newer cars, there's an import tax event that's going to benefit the government. So the question is how these different effects cancel out and what is the net impact, and that is non-trivial to obtain. And so it's important to understand how to quantify that and what is the result of that in order to understand what measures can be taken and avoid these revenue shortfall. Public transport use has a similar effect. As I was saying, more benefits because people spend less in fuel, more affordable transportation services, but the government will lose revenue. Particularly, there are fewer cars. Like if you're a Costa Rican and you know that you need a car to go to work, but now you have a good public transportation service, you may ask yourself, do I really need a car? And so because of a cultural aspect, people still want to have a car, but some people may not. And then that can impact the demand in the long term, because that may not happen in the near term. Of course, there are very complicated aspects related to the design of the city and urban development that can influence this demand for public transportation and the preferences of people. But that is still something that is expected to happen over the long term more than in the near term. So as you can see, there are winners and losers. changing the system means, yes, there's some potential benefits if you have a decarbonized transport system, but then you're going to need to make some adjustments. And that's the problem we study in this paper. Um, so, we have a current energy system. This is 2024 now. We're going to have two options, business as usual, so no policy change in terms of decarbonization. That's going to increase emissions, and the overall efficiency and level of investment in transportation or in the energy system in general is going to remain relatively the same as today. Because, for example, if GDP grows and there's no transformation of the energy system, we can expect sort of a similar energy intensity. Of course, there's some improvements, like technology gets better, there's more efficiency, but it's not like a radical change that you can expect from a fuel switching perspective. So business as usual is an option. Higher emissions. Osmosis models are very helpful at understanding this from a emissions and cost perspective. It is also good at modeling certain policies. So Costa Rica's overarching decarbonization policy is the National Decarbonization Plan. So this study, what I wanted to reflect was these two scenarios: business as usual, which is sort of an extrapolation of the current system, but also the NDP, which has a transformation. And in that transformation, emissions are reduced, the overall efficiency from end use to final consumption increases, and there's more investment. So that's going to have some implications in terms of the economic impacts and financial impacts. We use the terminology in the paper to refer to financial impacts as the direct cost change between scenarios for a given actor, and we're going to see the concept of actors briefly. But imagine you are a household, like you have a family and you have your family economy. And in the National Decarbonization Plan scenario for transportation and energy, you're going to have some income and some expenses. And in the business as usual, you would have some income and some expenses as well. So the impact is just defined as it's a benefit. So if you have more income than expenses in the NDP, then in the BAO you have a relative benefit because you're better off. And that's kind of what we're going to refer to as financial impact. Now, these are direct costs, meaning there are no like externalities or other indirect cost estimations in this metric, but taxes are included. So the government is going to have a financial impact, households are going to have a financial impact, and firms, so companies, private sector, the productive sector, is also going to have some elements of that. And we're going to quantify that using osmosis. Well, we did, past tense. So yeah, positive impacts are benefits and negative impacts are net costs. So it's an opportunity because we expect the NDP to have more benefits over the long term. And we're going to explore that in more depth. So how do we tackle that? So things like osmosis, tools like osmosis are very useful because they can help us have an internally consistent model of the energy system. So it's going to allow us to represent primary and secondary energy supply, the different transformation and distribution of energy, including vehicle technologies, and model energy uses or end uses of the energy. So think of kilometers traveled. So one important part of Costa Rica's osmosis model, which we used for this study, is the modeling transportation with kilometers, understanding and also passengers and also tons for freight, and understanding how different modes of transportation can produce or satisfy the demand of different passenger kilometers and ton kilometers demands. And then the modes of transportation are going to have different technologies using different energy carriers. So there's going to be, for instance, electric trucks, hydrogen trucks, gas trucks, meaning liquefied petroleum gas, or diesel, which is the default technology. And there are some shares of these technology options that are constrained into the model. So it is important to note that in this particular study, the constraints are used to define this this share of technologies, and future work can look at optimization, the optimal combination of vehicle technologies. So there are a lot of different ways in which the osmosis tool can be leveraged. But the most important for this policy investigation, the most important way to do that is by having the internal consistency, meaning the dimensioning of the system from a physical perspective and economic perspective makes sense. Because when you start running different demands and you check your energy balances are correct and your fleets are correct, the number of passengers makes sense. You quantify all those costs, and then you have to compare that to the national statistics to look at what the fiscal revenue has been. So having a well-calibrated osmosis model is going to be very useful to look at the combination of physics and energy, so petajoules, liters, number of vehicles, this physical layer, then the economic layer, that is the level of investment, the fiscal revenue, and then the environmental part, which is emissions mainly. So that is important, and that is the key way in which osmosis is used in this study. Now, as I've explained, the government can see its revenue reduced relatively, so maybe not relative to today, but relatively to what it could attain under a business as usual scenario. And so, of course, the government can say, oh, I don't care. I'm going to just raise other taxes like income taxes or general value-added tax. But in this particular paper, we explore how to substitute the revenue from transportation with tools from the transportation from the same sort of physical base. So if you look at the literature on this topic, you're going to have the term erosion of the revenue. And that is interesting to think of because you're going to have a tax revenue and it's going to start eroding as you have less fuel consumed. But there are tools. So Vendender from OECD, this is working paper, shows us a few interesting options. One of them being vehicle taxes, distance by vehicle and by road type and by place. So there are a lot of different distance taxes that can be applied. When we talk about vehicle taxes, think of how current tax policies may incentivize the adoption of electric vehicles through a subsidy. Now that produces fiscal impact because it's unrealized revenue for the government. As the technologies are just in the early stages of adoption and you start having a greater adoption down the road, that subsidy is going to be significant. So thinking of ways to remove those subsidies down the road, once the technologies are more competitive, is important to look at. So subsidies cannot stay until 2050. Otherwise, the governments are going to be greatly affected, particularly small, relatively smaller budgets governments like Costa Rica. And you can also think of raising fuel taxes, but then there's a distributional impact aspect that we're also going to study. And that is, who owns the electric vehicles? Is it the wealthier households or is it the poorer households that are going to be left with the more polluting vehicles. So it's non-trivial just to say, oh, just raise fuel taxes, and that's gonna also cover for the unrealized revenue. Um, so as you can see, it's not an easy solution, and there are different trade-offs that governments need to assess and compare. So how do we quantify that? So osmosis is going to be plugged to this transfer estimation module. There are going to be different energy companies modeled that are supplying the energy. They're going to have different technologies associated to them. So we know, for example, electricity firms are going to have all the power technologies, all the power plants, the distribution system, and the transmission that you model in osmosis. The hydrocarbon firms are a little easier because they just supply, since Costa Rica is mainly an importer of fuel, they're just supplying an imported primary energy carrier. Then there's a transport company. So since osmosis has different technologies like sedans, SUVs, buses, and many other types, we can sort of cluster that into different categories, including public transport operators, freight firms, and private transport owners, which are mainly households. And then, depending on the cost of the public transportation, because there's the bus that needs to be purchased by the company that operates the buses, but there's all the infrastructure, civil infrastructure that would enable um, higher adoption of public transport. So we also try to model the service prices of public transport users. Um, this final energy price is also going to take into account taxes. And one important thing is that the osmosis model often doesn't have the nuance of tax structure modeled into it because it would be quite difficult. Um, so this is a simulator that grabs osmosis results and then post-processes those results and estimates these different exchanges between actors and the different prices, considering taxes and also the um, annualized capital investment, um, so that we can have a proxy of a price for the end user, which is one great concern for policymakers. Of course, there's the government. So a component of this transaction is going to go to the government. And well, there are other things that don't go directly here. So think of mechanical shops where you repair your vehicles. Well, that's maintenance. And the vehicle importers and people that sell cars, that they're also outside of this sort of transaction module. But things can change a little bit in countries that produce vehicles, that have a car manufacturing industry, and can also have different criteria, more complex than here, with more relations. But this is our basic layout of the different transactions that happen and how we try to map those elements of the model that helps us estimate this cost and try to map that to the expenses of different households and different companies. Now, I'm going to try to summarize in 6 steps what was done in terms of methodology. So just to recap what I explained, osmosis-based runs give us a technological change in cost per scenario. So this cost can be thought of as an aggregated cost, but also the disaggregation of the cost per technology. This costs start without taxes, as I mentioned. Then the osmosis runs are then plugged into the transfer estimation module that I just explained. Then we estimate the tax revenues for the government following the national tax structure. So different taxes have different rates and it's very nuanced. So that's B. C, we estimate the fiscal impact, which is this revenue gap the government has between scenarios, as I've been explaining. Then D, this is kind of the interesting part where results are. Now we understand there's a fiscal impact, then we're going to have to understand how to reduce that or eliminate that fiscal impact so that the government still has its revenue in the future. So there are a few options. The first option we tried was, okay, just use one tax at a time, see what happens. So increase gasoline taxes. So there's a certain tax rate that can increase to a determined number that is going to theoretically close the gap. Although in practice, we know that tax is going to be huge. Because if you have very little gasoline consumption in 2050, to compensate for all the revenue, you're going to have like 1,000% tax rate, which doesn't make sense. But you can think of other less extreme cases, like what happens with the import taxes? How much should they uh, be increased, and who would get most affected? So that is the single tax at a time result that we obtain. So that is stress testing the specific policy option of increasing the property tax, using the distance travel tax, or import taxes, or taxes on electric vehicles, either for the electricity consumption or for their direct vehicle taxes. Then, since we understand that not all the houses are going to own the same kind of cars because there's a cost structure to that, and so wealthier households are going to have different kinds of households than different kinds of cars than poorer households. We use the National Income Survey that has very detailed data on this to disaggregate transportation expenses. At the time of developing this project, we also accessed a very detailed database of the Ministry of Finance that had the fiscal value of every car. So we're able to assign certain portions of the vehicle fleet to different levels of income of the household. So that proxy allowed us to estimate the impacts per income level and also per region. So, it's not the same what can happen in an urban area in terms of the costs and benefits than in the different rural areas surrounding the main urban areas. And that is important for an equitable transition and fiscal policy that policymakers need to take into account. Because as you can understand, this is not a purely technical issue. It's very economic, but also political. If you're going to raise taxes, you need to be sensitive to who you're going to put that burden on. Of course, you're removing burdens and you are adding more burdens. And that is a deeply political problem. And so finally, F, we test different combinations. There's an example combination in the paper where the gap is fiscal impact is closed by 25% by energy taxes, 25% by imports, 35% by taxes on distance, and the remaining 15% on property taxes. This is explored 1,000 times, 1,000 different combinations. Now, here are some of the results. First, there's the financial impact on aggregate. So on aggregate, there is a slightly more expensive result following the National Decarbonization Plan in this decade than in the following decades, and that is because the technologies are still not as cheap as they can be in the future, and also the investments required to leverage this transition and then allow a massive change and transformation of the transport system is required investments this decade. So that is why the near term looks more expensive, and that is why you have a negative financial impact. And then that is recovered in the next 20 years. Then firms and households have different shares. So in firms, and one of the big reasons why this is difficult or this is negative is because of freight. So, it's intuitive for us to think, okay, public transportation makes sense. It's cheap. Electric vehicles, it's cheap. Everybody's adopting electric vehicles for households. But then the freight sector, that one's a little harder. That one's going to require more investment. And the market, that's our understanding as of 2020, 2023. We know things are changing and now there are more options. But as of, the publication of this paper and the work we did, that's the reason why in the near term we have this negative value. So in aggregate, the benefit is 1.49% GDP yearly. That can vary year over year, but this is just a metric over a 30-year period at how much the benefit is. 149%. 1.49, sorry. As a yearly average in the period. That can be disaggregated between different types of vehicles. So We have the buses, the taxis, the light freight, and the heavy freight. These have the greatest higher cost. The private sector, like SUVs and sedans, this kind of smaller vehicles, is not too bad. Like the financial impact is very small, 2.6% benefit. So that there's actually a benefit there. It's the freight sector that has more difficulties in Costa Rica. And then per income level, um, we can see some interesting aspects, like the lowest income has the greatest financial impact, assuming that they start using public transportation and that it is affordable. There's some middle sectors that can have less of a benefit in the near term. In the long run, everybody benefits, particularly the highest income, as they would in the bow scenario, they will like buy these big trucks that are still very expensive and consume a lot of gas. So that's one of the reasons why we have this result. Um, because indeed, the highest income segment of the population spends a lot on transportation for different reasons than the lowest. So there are a lot of things going on behind that, a lot of narratives that can be further explored. Um, in terms of how the impact looks like over the different periods, we look at the last decade of the transition as having more benefits and more impact. So the fiscal impact, which is in the oranges here, isn't as great in the first years. So that what it's telling us is that fiscal impact is greater over the long run, and the benefits are greater over the long run. So this is kind of a problem of the future, but it's important to start understanding how to tackle it. Um, so the amount of revenue that needs to be compensated year to year on average is about 0.41% of GDP. That is a direct impact. But we also acknowledge that the benefits of 1.49% of GDP can also generate indirect revenue. So think if people are not spending their money on gasoline and maintaining the vehicles and paying taxes to the government through fuel taxes, they're going to have savings, but these savings are going to spend. And that spending can generate more income. So for Costa Rica, um, there's this indirect revenue percentage that we use of 20%, meaning the savings themselves can have can produce extra revenue, but this requires further investigation. What we focus on in this paper is comparing the direct, both benefits and um, the compensation that needs to be taken care of with the new taxes. So increasing sales taxes on vehicles, or new taxes on electricity and distance traveled. Now, of course, there's some practical aspects of leveraging these new taxes that are non-trivial. For instance, the electromobility tax. How are you going to separate electricity taxes for other uses from electric vehicles if most people charge at home? That can be really hard, and only future technologies could enable that. Um, like smart meters that know that how much electricity is going to the vehicle versus the rest of the house. Otherwise, you can impact the population in ways that can actually create backlash. And this kinds of consideration are also important. Think also of the distance traffic tax. So people already pay whenever they drive on a toll. They're going to pay normally as a way to pay for the road. Um, and that's Van Dender's discussion. Taxes on vehicles should focus on um, solving the externalities of transportation instead of just generating revenue to the government. So uh, those political aspects need to be also taken into account when a final decision is made by the governments. Let's also look a little bit at the magnitude. So this is why we have to be careful. Um, so for instance, if you relied on a fuel tax only, uh, and you want to tax LPG, the tax rates could be very high, 189 times the tax levied on the base year. So that is very high. Or I guess 68 times. So using fuel taxes, as you see here, the units are relative to 2019. Uh, it means raising taxes dramatically. This is not feasible. Um, but then, what's interesting is the example combination. So what we found is the combining taxes and increasing all the taxes a little bit and having all the tax base contribute um, is probably the option that would dilute the impacts a lot more in terms of the magnitude of the taxes, but also the impacts on the different quintils, regions, and also balancing between households and companies. So it has a it has a trade-off though, or a downside. The downside is that it's more difficult to implement politically because you'll be changing all of the taxes. All the taxes we have to somehow increase. Um, but at the same time, the impacts are lower. And so uh, it's an interesting trade-off that governments need to research and understand more deeply. This is one of the figures from the paper. The example combination, as I was saying, is more even across quintils and across firms relative to only using one individual tax. So again, impact on the right-hand side and the average tax rate on the left. That is important to take into account. Now, there's also the uncertainty aspect of it. Of course, the solutions are going to be the same if we have, for example, a risky condition like high EV cost, low EV adoption, low public transport use, and high private transport use. This is almost like an unsuccessful implementation of decarbonization. Under this scenario that is risky, well, there are not so many social benefits and not a lot of government revenue change. So it's almost like staying the same way as we are with the business as usual. It's more desirable, of course, if EVs get super cheap because people would make the transition and not spend as much. So they have a lot more savings. So, but of course, that depends on the market and what suppliers can do. EV adoption, if it's high, if there's more change and it's just cheaper to move around, of course, it makes sense. If people have a lot of public transport use, that is even greater because people are going to have to spend less money on transportation if this public transport is affordable. Under these conditions, there are more benefits, but also it's harder because uh, the the government needs to dramatically change their tax structure. So it's desirable, but it doesn't mean it is easy. It's an easy scenario to carry out. And yeah, finally, some interesting insights of what uncertainty can teach us and when we apply this to osmosis. Um, so there are very bad conditions here, very bad financial impacts for freight companies, for instance, in these different periods. And that can happen if you're forcing a transition in the freight sector, although what it does, it makes it less likely to happen. Um, but these negative values are associated with expensive freight decarbonization, which is one of the big challenges. Um, if the taxes on distance are applied to freight, you can also produce inflation because you'd be increasing the cost of goods. In the news, you listen to different experts say, "Oh, if fuel prices go up, there's inflation," um, because it affects all the movement of goods. It's similar if you start taxing trucks, uh, but instead of taxing on the field, you tax on the roads. So that's why there's like a sweet spot of the magnitude of that tax that needs to be associated with fixing the externalities, which for a truck would mainly be congestion and the wear and tear of the road. And then for private transport owners that have a lot of benefits here, if some households that are wealthier buy more expensive EVs. They just want to switch their big diesel luxurious SUV for an electric version. There's a possibility of taxing that down the road. So appropriate taxes are still a tool that can help deal with the regressive nature of taxes that apply to everyone. But it still is a political decision. And so there's a distributional aspects also that are interesting to explore. Um, and then in conclusion, there are 5 points to bring home. Increasing public transport use and electrifying the fleets can reduce energy and transportation costs, which is a very intuitive thing that has an implication on the tax revenue that is a reduction relative to not doing any change. The good news is that the benefits are greater than the fiscal impact. And options like vehicle kilometer taxes and property taxes can be interesting options, not just because of the results that I showed, where the magnitudes are more even when you combine taxes, but also because of the benefits they bring from a political perspective. So road taxes pay for the roads, and property taxes are sort of an indirect tax on wealth, on luxury goods. So, politically, they can be interesting. And then combining options, as I was saying, lowers the magnitudes of the taxes instead of relying on just one tax, and also dilutes the impact across the different suite of actors that we looked at in this paper. So future work. Well, as I said at the beginning, we don't look at the public spending side. So there's an interesting balance. So the government is going to have revenue. They still have to pay for a lot of things, infrastructure. It's not clear how that funneling of the funds happens. Sometimes, what the management of the budget is increase taxes and just spend on what you need. So looking at this coordination of revenue and spending from the government is interesting to look at. Then the trigger values of uncertainties. So we saw that if we're looking at a 25-year, 25-year transition, we don't know like how many electric vehicles are going to get adopted. We don't know what's going to happen with freight, and many other uncertainties. So it'd be interesting to have trigger values that say, oh, if the price of a truck is X, or the adoption of electric freight is Z, or whatever other unknown, then we can have some sort of rules that can tell the government, hey, you should probably start thinking about tax reform because of these reasons. So there's some interesting avenue in terms of uncertainty analysis and applying osmosis. And then there are three interesting things to add in terms of the current state of affairs in the world. So AI as a tool to implement the taxes and also the increases in productivity that they can bring, how they may affect revenue, and the relevance of environmental taxes. So that's point number 3 here. And what happens with robo taxes, that's also interesting. And then what can happen with the interest rates and risk. So interest rates can play a role in the cost of everything. So those are interesting avenues of future research. So as a summary, I know we ran out of time already. The first phase that we're on right now is, okay, incentivize adoption, government is subsidizing, things are changing. But then phase 2, the governments are going to start to monitor whether this change is affecting them deeply. And phase 3 is going to be some reform. Whenever you have a widespread adoption of these technologies, tax reform is probably going to be necessary to compensate for the lost revenues. So yeah, that is it. Thank you so much, and happy to take any questions if we have time. That works. If not, thank you.
Good, perfect. Thank you so much, Luis, for this extraordinary presentation. Very insightful with a good detail on the different steps in the process of the research. Let me take here the both of the questions. No, in the chat.
Can I ask a question
No.
while we
Yeah,
wait for
yeah,
Christopher?
of course, Kay, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much, Luis. Really, really great presentation, very detailed. Really nice to hear about your experiences and what you've done so far. I've also read some of your clues stuff as well because Fernando did a literature review for the OSeMOSYS, but I also did one for clues, which is in the process of being accepted. And actually, I think you're in two of the papers I might have included in there. Um, so yeah, very much enjoy your work and really, really good to hear about it. I think maybe you provided so much insight there. You probably covered almost all of my questions that I would have. So maybe I'll ask you a question that maybe might be slightly difficult to answer. Is that during the process of this, obviously I noticed there was multiple references. So it was obviously this is a work in progress over a long period of time. I just wondered what you thought was maybe the difficulties that you faced, whether that's, actually working with osmosis or whether it's more about project management, etc., and sort of maybe how you overcame those difficulties might be something that
Yeah.
people would be interested to
Yeah.
hear about for their own projects. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Alexander. That is a great question, and actually, I think I can offer interesting insight on this. This happened around post-COVID, like 2020, 2021, and we had interesting conversations with the Ministry of Finance by then. They were just coming out of a fiscal reform that hadn't happened in years. So they were very skeptical because they just had passed a lot of tax increases. It was a big deal in the country. So the politics were difficult, but not as difficult because everybody was, in the COVID mood. So everybody was like, okay, yeah, we know it's hard. Um, and I think the first meetings took place, if I'm not mistaken, maybe before COVID or while COVID was starting. So it was still like, I think it was the beginning of 2020. And what happened then was, there's some actors within the ministry because this projects, they are responding to some policy questions that are hard to answer. So, it's the beginning of generating insights to answer those questions. And, the stakeholders are looking at a problem that is still not a problem. They're usually, in the case of the Ministry of Finance, they're looking at the present and the past. And they look at the future, but not 30 years into the future. And at the time, there was a perception that decarbonization was an elitist idea. So, oh, you want to introduce electric vehicles to people, but people actually rely on diesel for the work and trucks and whatnot. So there's sensitivity, political sensitivity, and what you can probably see in our day as a politicization of climate action, right? So I don't think at the time that was the case. It was more of a how do you communicate a problem of the future that is still not yet there, which is kind of what osmosis helps us deal with, like planning, right? But how you communicate that or how do you communicate that to actors that have, different interests and different priorities in terms of their work. And to me, I think that was the most challenging thing. And we were fortunate enough to be collaborating with the bilateral bank in the case of the IDB. So there's politics regarding that. They give some reputation and importance to the work. So at the moment, it was manageable, but of course it generates on the researchers, this stress, right? The dealing with stakeholders that may not like the idea of big changes or maybe skeptical about the plausibility of the scenarios, right? Because they say, oh, sure, 1.49% of GDP in benefits, but that's not going to happen because people are not going to buy electric cars and they're going to want to use a car instead of the bus. So communicating that and still engaging with them and showing the importance of the problem and the relevance of the research for the future, I think that's a big challenge. And as practitioners of using osmosis and the tools, it's important to look at techniques. I cannot say that I have a technique. It's just more on an ad hoc basis how you can present your results and your narratives and engage with the stakeholders so they can provide insights, and they can also use the results for whatever they're doing. It's harder when you're looking at a long-term problem, but there's some mechanisms like when you're talking about potential funding and financing, having or preparing these kinds of scenarios and knowing sort of possible paths to deal with problems that can happen down the road, particularly if you're looking at the credit worthiness of governments. I think there's like a demand to be able to understand this, to be able to use osmosis to generate these kinds of insights. And then if that demand is there, the question is, well, how do you engage properly with the stakeholders as modelers? And I think that's where the challenge is. As we move forward with the energy transition and decarbonization, this is going to happen more and more. There's more awareness of people, but there's also like competing ideas, as I was saying, AI and all these things that were not a thing 2 years ago or 3 years ago are now important. So navigating all those challenges in terms of attention and interest, I think is where the challenges lie ahead.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Luis. Great answer. And again, great presentation. I look forward to seeing more of your work. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. We had a couple of questions in our bots, but I tried to respond it because the first one it was related to the link to your paper, Luis. So I just shared the link of the paper essentially. And the
Yeah.
second one is maybe if you want to re-add on that is I apologize for the question out of the topic. As someone who is starting out in the area of energy modeling and policy research, could you point resources to start with for someone with software electronics engineering background? Please do not
Hmm.
feel obligated to respond here, etc. But I share the set of our online courses in the Open University in the context
Yeah.
of CCG, but I'm not sure if you have anything else that maybe could be useful for the colleague.
Sure. Yeah. No. Thanks. I think it's an interesting question and maybe a little philosophical here. So we live in a world that's changing a lot. Energy is when I started with working with energy, I thought, okay, energy is good because it's inelastic. People are always going to need energy. And if you look at the news, what's going on with AI, kind of the constraint of the AI is energy. They want to build a lot of nuclear power plants in the US. So I think for the colleagues starting out, I think the tools are okay to learn, like the courses are good to learn. Now you can learn faster. The AI teaches you like if you have a bug or something, you still have to go through the bug, but still the AI is going to help you. But then I think in the sort of the knowledge work area, our our purpose now is to be able to think through the noise and looking at what people need in the world and how we can move forward to a better place. So thinking about the issues is important because that's going to give you the motivation to actually work through all the challenges, the nuance of actually learning modeling work, and we're engaging with stakeholders and all these things. Beyond the interesting problems and the intellectual sort of challenges and jobs we have to do, there's still the purpose of actually getting to a better place. And I think that's what I would recommend the colleague. Just stay curious, learn as much as you can, and think about why we're doing this research and this work is to get to a better place. Everyone in the world, taking care of the earth, but also taking care of people's affordability. So energy is affordability, is quality of life. So it's important work. And yeah, that's my advice.
Good, thank you. Finally, we have our question from Christopher. So, first of all, thank you for the presentation. In the decarbonization, did you consider the fossil fuel phase out strategies in transportation, for example, by 2035, let's say 35% of clean transportation. Though I'm not directly working on transport sector, this topic is interesting because countries like Zambia, there
Mhm.
the electricity rate is about 50%.
Mm. Yes, there are a lot of things that it is, I don't know, maybe I can go back to the slide. Yeah. So these transport companies are going to have a technological change, right? So the phase out is going to be there. And yes, we used for this particular results, they depend on the National Decarbonization Plan's target mainly, which include an electrification rate. The electrification rate is directly linked to a phase out of fossil fuel vehicles. So, the target variable is the percentage and the distribution of the fleet. Then that has repercussion on the consumption of fuel, certainly. Uh, but to your point of the electricity rate, I think that is a big challenge, and country by country, it's important to look at what can happen for the electricity price to actually be competitive. Because if you're going to have, it's like a chicken and egg problem. You're going to generate more demand for electricity. You're going to need more investment to supply all that energy. Um, and that, of course, involves paying, a loan or investment or something that, is associated with a power plant or and the infrastructure. So it is not trivial to look at what happens with the price. If you look at recent literature, what's happening is, for instance, AI. I'm sorry, I'm just repeating AI. AI demand in the 2030s is gonna lead to some electricity price increases because it's pushing demand. So whenever you have more demand of something, price goes up. And I think that is a challenge. In the case of Costa Rica, there is an advantage, and that is that we have a lot of installed capacity already, and with some demand management, we can sort of sort it out. So I think looking at demand management is actually very important. So what you want to do is increase the capacity factors of your power sector. So you want to utilize your renewables, but also whatever fossil you have in hydro as much as you want. And that basically means matching supply and demand. So it's not just the technological change of switching from a fossil vehicle to an electric vehicle, but then when you work with electric vehicle, make sure you are also building the preparations to actually control that demand and make the most out of your installed capacity in terms of an hourly to hourly basis. That is a complex problem, um, but it's also it can have very interesting benefits. As I said, less peak demand would lead to relatively lower prices. Relative to a scenario where your demand is very high in terms of the peak, right? So uh, I think that is an area of research that needs a lot of attention. And yeah, hopefully that's useful for our colleague, Christopher.
Good. Thank you, Luis. Just
Yeah.
I would say we have one final, very small question is that will this presentation be available to view later on? So it's like, do you have the possibility to share this presentation with the audience?
I do. I just need to figure out how. But if I can coordinate with you, I would be happy to share it.
Okay, good, perfect. So yeah, so after the session, I think we can share the presentation with you with the students. I mean, not the students, the attendants.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So yeah,
sounds
the,
good.
the the answer would be yes.
Yes.
Good, perfect. So
Good.
once again, thank you so much, Luis, for
Thank you.
your time, your dedication to prepare this presentation, and just I'm quite sure that you are still working very hard on new projects. So my best wishes and success
Thank you.
and your upcoming projects. And thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to present this work. It's a pleasure. And yeah, I look forward to future webinars maybe. And best of luck to everyone at CCG and the attendees. Have a good
Perfect.
one.
Thank you so
Take care.
much, everyone, for attending, and have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.